Hey, it's Joe Bacino here. This is a Saturday. It's Saturday, February 20th. We're releasing on a Saturday. Traditionally, we release on a Tuesday, but we're releasing on a Saturday. This is a special episode commemorating Black History Month and commemorating the grand legacy of black soldiers in our Army. We have a great guest, and thanks for listening.
File into the bunker and take your seats. The broadcast is about to begin. From Fort Bragg, North Carolina, this is the Doomsday Clock. Stories from the brink of Armageddon. Brought to you by the 18th Airborne Corps.
Hey, Joe Bacino here. We have today a great guest. We have Chuck Allen, a friend of mine, a retired Army colonel, a professor at the U.S. Army War College, and he is a great guest to have on to commemorate the history, the proud legacy, and really, in many ways, the unknown story of black soldiers in our Army. And, this is Black History Month. It's so important that we give voice to this history, and he is the perfect guest to do that. We will have another episode out on Tuesday, February 23rd. Our guest for that will be Fred Kaplan. But today we're talking about black soldiers in our Army, progress made, not enough progress made. We're talking about the integration of our Army by Harry Truman, talking about a lot of stories that people don't know about, a lot of things I didn't know about. So Chuck Allen, our guest, is a retired Army colonel. He culminated a 30-year career in uniform at the Army War College. He's a 1978 graduate of West Point, a variety of assignments in the artillery community, and he is now a very prolific writer on this subject, the subject we're talking about, the unknown stories of black soldiers throughout our time, throughout our history, and throughout our Army. He does a lot of great work on this. He also teaches leadership at War College. He's written for Armed Forces and Society, the Journal of Military Ethics, the Washington Post, Military Times, Army Times. He's got bylines everywhere. Great guy to talk to on this subject and a great guest. Before we talk to Chuck Allen, one thing we mentioned here is the signing by Harry Truman of Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948. This was a pretty controversial executive order desegregating the military. And in fact, the Army leadership, Army uniformed leadership, argued against this. They thought it was going to be detrimental to recruiting in the Army. They thought it would be detrimental to morale, to readiness. So the Army was opposed to this. Obviously, we've come a long way since 1948, but here is a reading of Executive Order 9981 by Mike Noggle, who works with us. He'll read Executive Order 9981, the actual verbiage of it, and then we'll go into our discussion with Chuck Allen.
It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. This policy shall be put into effect as rapidly as possible, having due regard to the time required to effectuate any necessary changes without impairing efficiency or morale.
Sir, we talk on this show about Harry Truman all the time. For the purposes of our discussion today, talking about Black History Month, Harry Truman is the architect of really one of the most important civil rights achievements in our history, and that is the integration of the United States military. But he was an unlikely champion of integration, wasn't he?
I would say yes. I grew up in Missouri, so he's a product of his culture at the time. So we may assign some altruism to what Truman has done for Black history and integration, but there's probably some other considerations that played a role.
He signed Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, integrating the United States military, beating back segregation. He was influenced to do so by civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. So there's an interesting story behind that. A. Philip Randolph was the president or the lead of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And he was a very strong union organizer, but also a civil rights activist. So the story of 9981 did not begin with Truman. It actually began with FDR, with Roosevelt. So back in 1941, as A. Philip Randolph was watching the engagements across the water, the activities of U.S. military members, he noticed with disgust that African Americans were not allowed to participate in the defense industry. They were being segregated within the armed forces, and they were also segregated within the U.S. government. So he had petitioned Roosevelt to address civil rights back in 1941. Roosevelt was able to negotiate and put together a Fair Practices Employment Act in 1941 with an Executive Order 8802 that opened up the defense industry for integration with the African Americans in our society. That laid the groundwork for Truman's engagement with A. Philip Randolph. Again, looking in the 1948 timeframe after World War II, the need to repopulate and remand the force, Truman needed African Americans to be part of the society, but also a good part of the U.S. military. So A. Philip Randolph forced the issue in a discussion with Truman to put together that EO 9981. What we also know is that before 9981, that same day, Truman put together Executive Order 9980, which opened up equal treatment and fair practices within the federal government. He called it the federal establishment.
Well, Truman, like you, was an artilleryman in World War I. Is there anything from his experience in that war that perhaps inspired him or came into play here when he made this decision or considered integrating the Army?
I don't have any documentation of his direct involvement, but I do know that in World War I, we had a segregated force. Again, African Americans served primarily in what's called the 93rd Division, and consisting of National Guard regiments that were converted to active duty forces for the war. And we had a unit, again, the 93rd Division, that was sent overseas and would not be employed by U.S. forces, but were provided to the French Army. They performed exceptionally well. They were called the Bloody Hand Division, and they received the French Croix de Guerre because of the distinguished performance and combat effectiveness within the French Army. So that had to be known for in the U.S., but also as Truman was an artillery officer back in World War I.
Truman grew up racist, was racist into his adult life, grew up amidst slaves, his grandparents owned slaves. So, he certainly did have some sort of reconsideration on this issue, but by 1948, he is a desperate politician. He needs the black vote. He's really lost a lot of the white Southern vote running against Thomas Dewey, the Republican. Is there a way to tell how much of EO 9981 is political calculation and how much was something he really believed in?
I think we can look at some of his presidential transcripts, how we refer to African Americans in times when he was stressed or behind closed doors. We might find, again, is that decisions that are made at that level are always political. But they also have a outside influence that can have good results. Again, because he did sign the Executive Order 9981 directing the integration of the armed forces, that was a good thing. How we got there probably is not as important as to what we actually did in the process. So what he did with the Executive Order not only required to address discrimination, he also charged the armed forces, the Army and the Navy, to come up with a plan and then a committee to implement the plan for integration. That's a big step for anyone, even though their hand may have been forced by political considerations.
Leaving behind Harry Truman here for this discussion, I really love something you wrote in the Military Times in February 2019, that Black History Month provides the opportunity for us to be curious, to look around, and to learn more about the contributions made by African Americans to our country. And just reading your work and talking to you, I always learn things I didn't know about Black soldiers and Black leaders in our history. And that really is the story of our Army and our Department of Defense. So who has inspired you?
So as I've been in the military for a number of years, active duty, and then as I retired, I took the opportunity to use Black History Month as a way to go back and look and see what history that was, in my viewpoint, in my blind spot. So I'm a West Point graduate class of 1978. So the first one I went back to was Henry O. Flipper, who was the first African-American graduate of West Point in the class of 1877. Again, born a slave in Georgia, went to West Point in 1873, did fairly well as a cadet, and was commissioned as a young cavalry officer in the 10th U.S. Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers in the Western Plains. Obviously, you can imagine that he had several challenges being a cadet at West Point, very isolated, and deemed to not belong there. He persevered. Being a Buffalo Soldier out on the plains, I had some other challenges with, I'll call it systemic or cultural racism. I persevered through that, worked for the Department of Justice, Secretary of Interior, and he did phenomenally well for the U.S. nation beyond the military service. So he set the stage again for those that came behind him. And Flipper graduated in the class of 1877. We had two other graduates, John Hanks Alexander in 1887, and then Charles Young, 1888, who became the first colonel of African-American descent with the United States Army. They set the stage, again, for the folks that we find in general officer positions now in the United States military. Obviously, Colin Powell comes to mind. New Secretary of Defense, retired General Lloyd Austin, a West Point graduate, all had foundations that were set by Henry O. Flipper back in 1877.
Yeah, and Lloyd Austin, of course, the first African-American Secretary of Defense, really points the way towards where I think the Department of Defense is going, where our Army is going, and looking towards increased representation across leadership, across senior leadership. That's been a struggle for the Army. It's something that the Army has been talking about really for the last 7 years, at least as I recall, the integration of minorities and African Americans in the top ranks. How is that going for the Army?
I think it's always a point of concern, but also you have to make an assessment and judge your progress with that. Again, General Austin was the first African American to be a combatant commander in combat as a Central Command commanding general. He had phenomenal assignments as he grew up in his military career. Again, operational assignments in tactical units, but also assignments within the enterprise and the Joint Staff and other headquarters. So what we'll find here again, as we're trying to develop representation at the highest level within our military, you want to make sure that you have talented people with potential. Have the three things are diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we'll find is that we get diversity by having people who have differences. It could be skin color, it could be ethnic group, it could be gender, coming together to work on tough problems. So you have to have, the old term was equality of opportunity, which really is a degree of equity. How do we get them the assignments that they need to be successful working in the Joint Staff? How do we get them the education that they need, being selected for the professional military education programs like Command and General Staff College or the War College? And how do we get them promoted in the tracks and in the skill sets that the Army might need that matches their potential? All that points to is a great need for inclusion to build the best team that we can. The Army and the Department of Defense have always got to pay attention to that and wrestle with it over the duration of a given year or even an era. Sometimes we'll have high numbers in higher ranks. Oftentimes we're trying to achieve a floor of about maybe 10% or so of African Americans as minorities of the senior general officer ranks. And that remains a challenge with us, I think, because of the pipeline, but also the perception of opportunity within the force.
As we close out this episode here on Black History Month and celebrating Black soldiers, who out there should our audience read about, or who should we research? What are some of the unknown stories, or the lesser-known soldiers that our audience should know about?
So again, I take this opportunity each year to find someone within our military history that are part of American history. This year, I selected Major General Charles C. Rogers. He was an African-American from a historically black college and university, West Virginia College, graduated in 1951. I went on to be commissioned as an artillery lieutenant, nice branch to have. I did exceptionally well in commanding 2 batteries, became a battalion and a brigade S3, selected for the Command and General Staff College, selected for the Army War College, en route, had commanded successfully in combat in Vietnam, where he won a Congressional Medal of Honor based upon a battle that he took part of in Vietnam in 1968 in support of Fire Support Base Rita. So a phenomenal officer, did exceptionally well, had talent, proven in combat, and then became a 2-star general in the United States Army, again, doing great things for our force. Those are stories that are out there that we sometimes forget, and we have to go back and regenerate our knowledge about the good things that have happened before for our military and our soldiers.
Well, sir, I want to thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your scholarship and really everything you've done to highlight, really, and personally educate me on this grand history and this history of accomplishments, and really it's so enlightening for me to read your work, and I encourage others to do so.
As you said before, that Black history is American history, so there's a number of folks of talent, of great contribution that are out there. Sometimes we just have to open our eyes and do a little digging and then realize the great treasures that we have among our force, not only those that have already gone before us, but those in our formation that are here now that can do great things for us. So thanks for this opportunity, Joe. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Have a great day.
All right, you too. Take care.
Thanks. Take care. We'll see you. Bye. All right, that was our discussion with Chuck Allen. We thank him. We thank the Army War College. And look, we encourage you to read through these things. Look for his byline. Read his work. There's a great book that I want to recommend here. It's by Ron James, Ron, R-A-W-N, Ron James Jr., The Double V. And it's about Harry Truman's desegregation of the military and why he did it and why it was unpopular, and how the Army reacted. It's a great book to read. It's a great time to read it. And thanks so much for listening to the show. We've got another episode this coming Tuesday. We've got Fred Kaplan. That is a good one. It's a long one. We talk about The Bomb, which is the name of his latest book. And so that's one you'll want to check out. Fred Kaplan is one of our foremost authorities on mutually assured destruction, the development of the ideas behind it, the arms race. And we start in World War II and we end in last month. So it's a wide-ranging discussion with a fascinating guy and a lot of interesting stories in there. So thanks so much for listening, and check us out on Tuesday.